Tensions in Los Angeles appear to be easing after 3 straight days of unrest over immigration raids. Overnight, the protests that had gripped downtown LA grew calmer, according to our correspondent on the ground. Mayor Karen Bass has urged protesters to avoid violence and chaos. On Sunday, cars were set on fire and a British photographer was injured, shot with a sponge bullet, requiring surgery. The unrest has given current President Donald Trump a new opening to push his tough law and order agenda. He has deployed the National Guard, overriding the wishes of California Governor Gavin Newsom. North American correspondent Anthony Zutcher reports that Trump is using the violence to justify a crackdown on left-wing unrest. As calm returns to the streets, the political fallout is just beginning. We now know that also in San Francisco, there was arrest of 50 people during the protests, and now U.S. has other states following the suit of protests. As the protest that had grappled downtown LA grew calmer in LA, but it's growing further to the rest of the states. However, according to our correspondent on the ground, Mayor Karen Bass has urged protesters to... Now we have guests joining us, Spencer Clitchery. He's a communication strategist. He's joining us live from California. Thank you for joining us today. How do you interpret the political message behind President Trump's decision to deploy the National Guard to LA without governor's request?
Well, this is of a piece with Trump's essentially authoritarian nature and his organized effort to make himself an autocratic leader in what is supposed to be a democracy. Of course, law and order needs to be preserved. Local authorities are very well trained and equipped to do that, and the governor and local city and county level authorities are completely familiar with the procedure for calling out the National Guard if they need to do that. That's not at all what this is about. Trump, once again, is trying to make Americans panic about a so-called invasion of foreigners. The point of that has nothing to do with protecting Americans and everything to do with exploiting fear in order to justify his seizure of power. You know, this is typical with authoritarians. They select one or two groups who are supposedly an existential threat to the nation or to the religion or whatever the excuse is, and use that to mobilize people behind them and to justify the termination of normal democratic rights. I often think of the transaction involved here as, from the authoritarian's point of view, you get feelings and I get power. In other words, I fire up your passions over nationalism or over religion or just general fear and hatred, and while you get to enjoy those feelings, I get to seize power.
And how do you respond to critics who say Democratic leaders have been slow or ineffective in communicating a coherent stance on immigration enforcement and protest management?
I think generally speaking that's true. I think the Democratic Party is in a very serious state in terms of just what it stands for. I'm writing about this now. I'm actually working on a book which I'm calling The Liberal Backbone, addressing the question of what happened to the liberal backbone, because while Democrats do have a strong set of values, which include respect for human rights and basic human compassion, they seem to have lost the ability to communicate those values clearly. Democrats have been shying away from the immigration issue, not all of them, but too many of them, because they feel the polling is bad for them on immigration. And they don't seem to understand that what people really want is a leader or leaders who will actually stand up for what they believe in, first of all, whatever it is that they do believe in. But if you're running away from bad poll numbers, you're showing exactly the opposite.
And building on what you said, how can Democratic leaders balance supporting peaceful protest while distancing themselves from violent elements that emerged during these past 3 days demonstrations?
Well, one sign of hope is I think there has been quite a lot of clarity from Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, from California Governor Gavin Newsom, from local Democratic members of Congress who represent that area, from local community leaders within the particular neighborhoods. They've been basically unanimous in saying that violence is wrong. Protest is a sacred constitutional right in the United States as long as it's peaceful. So peaceful protesters must be protected. But there's no justification for throwing rocks at police or setting cars on fire, which a minority of the protesters have been doing. So I think this is actually a good sign that there has been clarity from the top down in the state of California about this. I would note that those protesters who are throwing rocks and lighting fires and that sort of thing, very often those people come from outside. I have some direct experience of this in my work, and unfortunately you get these ideologues or just basically people playing dress up as revolutionaries for the weekend, and they do enormous damage. And if they wanted Donald Trump to succeed, they could hardly do better than by doing things like throwing rocks at police and lighting things on fire.
And on a related note, the optics of ICE raids followed by military presence in a sanctuary city are stark, and how should Democrats frame this to resonate with both immigrant communities and moderate voters?
Well, again, if you know what you stand for, you don't have to tailor your message for different audiences. And this is a big part of the problem with Democrats these days, is they try to figure out how can we say something to immigrants, how can we say something to people who are worried about immigration, how can we say something to all of these different audiences. But if you actually know what you stand for, it becomes much simpler, and you can communicate with multiple audiences, because ultimately people respect the fact that you actually do have values. And Democrats are on the right side of this issue, not just from the point of view of compassion and respect for rights, but in terms of what's effective in law enforcement and maintaining the peace. Again, I have quite a lot of experience of this because I've consulted with police departments in my communications function, including one that had to deal with large-scale protests and some very serious challenges, but was an excellent department, not only compassionate, but also very effective at dealing with crime. And what works is not to roll out with your armored vehicles and making these displays of force with what look like soldiers, and some of them are soldiers, members of the National Guard, in some cases posing with military-style weapons. This is exactly what you don't do. You must be ready to respond with force if you need to, but making these visible displays of it is provocative, excuse me, and makes things worse. Of course, that is Donald Trump's objective, is to provoke exactly the disorder that we did see over the weekend. And this is not just my opinion, though, about what actually does work. This has been shown through research over decades now, and I've seen it happen myself, where violent crime problems go down dramatically when you know how to follow current thinking in law enforcement. So as I say, this is not just a question of Democrats, being softer than Republicans in terms of whether or not they want to beat protesters over the head. This is a question of what actually works.
And Spencer, that brings us to this critical question: that what communication tactics would you recommend for countering the administration's framing of these protests as lawlessness rather than civil resistance? Do you think the criticism of Governor Newsom for allegedly losing control of the situation holds merit?
They had not lost control of the situation. There was some violence on the first day of protests near the Home Depot in the city of Paramount, for example. but it's nothing that's beyond the ability of local law enforcement to deal with. It started to escalate when Donald Trump started talking about sending in the National Guard, and then when he actually did. That provides an opportunity for the people who do want to create disorder in the streets. That starts to draw in these outsiders and these other folks who don't necessarily, I don't believe, actually care all that much about what happens to the local people, but who see it as an opportunity to just advance their particular ideological agenda, or, as I say, have a weekend pretending to be revolutionaries and then go home and leave folks to have to continue to deal with the actual situation on the ground. I think that the correct approach is the one that we are seeing so far from Mayor Karen Bass and Gavin Newsom, which is to emphasize that, yes, it is wrong to commit violent acts in the course of a protest, and we will find you, and arrest you, and you will have to face the justice system if you do that. And at the same time, it's very clear what Donald Trump is doing here. This is about him and seizing authoritarian power for himself. This has nothing to do with solving any problems with immigration or maintaining the peace. In fact, precisely the opposite. It serves his advantages the more disorder there is, because again, this is the excuse authoritarians always use to step in and justify taking away people's rights, because they need to have an emergency to justify that, and they will create the emergency if one doesn't already exist.
Thank you very much, Spencer Critchley, for joining us and bringing your expertise and sharing that